they all got erased.
No. Did it go all the way back?
Of the United States, and it's quite fitting at this time then to record the narratives, the memories and reminiscence of my parents, Fred William Steffes, born September the 25th, 1899 at Wayne, Missouri, and my mother, Rose Catherine King, born September the 10th, 1900 at Stanberry, Missouri. During these 75 or so years of their life, many things have happened. There have been many changes in the country. And they will record for posterity, along with recollections that were told to them by their parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and other people with whom they came in contact with. This will make an interesting story for those who come after us to relive as they hear their story. So now I will turn this microphone over to my father, who will begin the narrative.
Well, as we were thinking about the bicentennial, it makes me think of George Washington. He wore long hair. Well, in my younger days, that was long, I say before I started to school. And I started school when I was 7 years old. And they left my hair grow, and I had long hair, and my sister used to curl them. She had a curling iron, and they practically made a girl out of me. And they even had my picture taken that way. Well, when I had to start to school, Dad said he was going to have to cut his hair. And Sister Louise didn't want that. She said, "Oh, don't cut his hair off." But he clipped her off pretty short anyway, and that was the end of the long hair. And now, we'll say from 70 years back, now they're growing hair also. But they're going to school with their long hair. How long they'll wear their long hair, it will be hard to tell. Back to the school days, them days, all the boys wore knee-length pants. That is, the dress pants, what we generally call Sunday clothes. And they wore them until they graduated from the grade schools. And then they switched back to wearing long leg pants. And that was my most embarrassment moment, to make that change. And I knew I had to go down from the place where I lived there in Wayne to walk down to the school. And I seen there were a lot of the older girls playing out in the front schoolyard, and I'd had to walk down right among them to go into school. And they were supposed to meet there that day, but I had to get up my nerve to do it, so I went. And sure enough, when I got down toward the school, they all went to pointing fingers and saying, "There comes long pants," and laughing at me, and I felt very embarrassed.
The first that I can remember definitely is the first day of school. There wasn't many things that happened in between time, but they're not so easily recollected just at this time. But we had to go 1.25 miles, and I can remember I had a great big straw hat on, and me and my brothers and my sisters, we walked and we took our dinner pail. And I can remember my first school teacher, Agnes Sharp. She was a lovely lady, and she went for, I guess she taught about 6 years. Them were happy days out in the old schoolyard. You could go out and play any kind of game, and they wasn't divided. The boys would stand the girls, and then they did choose up sides, and they'd play all kind of games. We had an hour at noon and 15-minute recess between. We went to school at 9 o'clock, and got home after 4. And of course, we children, that is the Catholic children, had their religion teaching after school, and all the Protestant children went home at 4 o'clock. But we had to stay 2 or 3 days we had the catechism, and the other 2 days we had Bible history. Then on Sunday we had our half hour at our church at Conception.
Now at my school, we wasn't allowed to play with the girls. The boys had their grounds where they played all their games, and the girls had their area where they played their games.
You missed all the fun. And I'll tell you the games we played. We played surround air base, we played ball, we played Rin Tin Tin, and we played hide and go seek. Well, there was many games. And we played together, and we had a lot of fun. And then when on rainy days, well, we sat around the big old stove, and there was one boy that played the French harp. We had a lot of times in our school days. Of course, the studies wasn't quite as good as it was for to hear the music.
All the games I can remember we played at school, it was baseball, marbles, and run sheep run. That was just some would hide far distance off, and they'd had to see if they could make it home before the boys that was hunting them could find them. Winter we'd skate. We had a pond near the school, and sleigh ride. Had a good hill for that. And that was about it, and jump rope. Well, I want to add on to our school, they really whipped the devil out of them. We had a timber right in a ravine north of our schoolhouse, and it growed brush and hazel brush. And they'd use those hazel brush switches for to whip us. And they'd even sent some of the children down there to get a few. And I'm telling you, them were some tough switches. They'd either hit you over the hands for something that you didn't do right, or either over your butt. And one time, I was pretty young that time, and I thought, well, I'll put one over on that teacher. I slipped a little geography in my seat of my pants. But by gosh, when she took me out in the hall and led me over her knees, she knew there was something squared up. So she reached in there and got it out, but I got some licks out of it anyway. All of my teachers were none, and they really were strict. You'd had to obey, or either you'd be in for it.
When we got home from school of an evening, we'd have a little lunch and then out to do our chores. We'd have to milk and feed the chickens and water and bring in the eggs, and a lot of times bring in the coal, the cobs, and the wood, whatever we had on the farm. And then as we got older, we all had to help milk. Boy, that was a job. Milk a lot of cows and go up the hill to the house from the lower barn, which is quite a hill to climb when you carried 2 buckets of milk. On Sunday, when we'd get ready to go to church, we couldn't all go at one time. Some would stay home and prepare dinner because we usually went to 10 o'clock Mass. We had to go 6 miles to church at Conception, Missouri. And then we would go in the surrey and a buggy. And they drove mules and also ponies, whichever which we could go in. The roads weren't paved like they are today. And boy, in the wintertime when it was frozen, it was a pretty rough ride. Sometimes we would get home about noon and then have dinner, and a lot of times when we would have company come, why, it would be 1 o'clock. Made our afternoon short, but we had a good time anyhow. The children went outside and played by themselves, and the old folks stayed in the house and conversated.
While we were talking about churches and schools, I'll relate what I remember my father was telling me in the years of about 1871 and 2, we had a log school in Wayne. And then in 1876, they built the church. And My father was telling he was a hod carrier. When they built that church, they'd carry their bricks in a hod they put over their strap over their shoulders, and they'd take them up on the ladder. And the outside of the church to the top to the gutters were 40 feet. And also the steeple was built with ramps, and they used wheelbars that time. And the amazing thing is, it's a large building, and it was foundation was made with a hewed rock, and it was foundation was dug 6 foot deep, and it was 4 foot wide. And that building is in good shape today yet, and it's 100 years old now. The bricks were burnt on Bee Branch Creek, and that's about a half a mile from Wayne. In fact, all the buildings that were built in Wayne out of bricks, they were burnt or made. They always call them burnt bricks, made along this Bee Branch Creek. And my father built a store in 1914 with bricks, and he had them made on one of his farms. And that was quite a thing to see how they made them. There was a lot of work to that. They'd dig a pit alongside of the ditch, so they'd have water also, and they'd shovel mud in this pit, and then they had just chopped down a tree that's about 10 inches or rather 6 or 8 inches in diameter, and leave some of the limbs on. They were cut off, and they'd extend about 12 or 14 inches to turn this mud and mix it. They had a horse on it, had a pole on top to turn that. So the brick man, he would take this mud when it's just the right stage, just like bread dough. It looked like he just made them in like a bread loaf, and he'd slap them right in a tray, the L3, and then he'd cut them off with a wire just like a bow. That's for bow and arrow like. And then they had young schoolboys in vacation time, that was, and they'd carry them out in the yard to dry. And then they'd build, after they'd dried, they'd build this kiln. And it really looked like a building when they got through with it. And then they had their open places where they had used the rails and long wood to burn. And we hauled all of them together, and Dad bought a lot of old rail fences that were in the country yet, and they were really a good firewood. I wanted to mention that steeple on our church, it's 130 feet high from the ground. And then in 1911, they built a brick schoolhouse. And it's a very large building, like 58, 60 feet. And a lot of that was donated work by the parish here. They dug the basement with horses and mules, with scrapers, shovels, and grubbing hoes. And that was all donated work. And a lot of other work that was needed by handwork when they needed some help was donated. And that building only cost $11,000. That's quite some difference, thinking of the prices of today. And it's a two-story building and a full basement underneath. I forgot to mention about the school building that was built after the log school. After the church was built in 1876, they had built a wood frame building for school. There's 2 rooms. And then we used that school until we built this brick building in 1911.
Now we'll pass on from school days on to in-between times. We would have to work in help make garden, and then go out and hoe it, and then bring in the vegetables and help Mom with the work of canning it and preparing it. Sometimes we would can, sometimes we would dry. Sometimes we'd take the corn and we'd pickle it. Oh, there was quite a lot of work on the farm when you did all that, and plus all the chores that we had to help with.
While we was talking about work, I'll relate what my father told me in earlier days when he cradled wheat. There was two big men, they were strong fellows, and they sized down 5 acres of wheat. And that cradle, naturally, you know, throws it in bunches every time they make a sweep with their size. And people come along and tie up those bundles with straw. And that is a lot of size, 5 acres in one day for 2 men. So then the reaper come along, that I don't know nothing about. That was before my time too. Then come the binder. Well, that was our machine that we used. And we'd have one to do the binding, and then there'd be a couple fellows shocking the grain.
Yes, and I helped shock the grain too, many a time, along with my brothers.
Mama had to do those things. They didn't have too much help after the father died, and she was one of the oldest ones, so that's why I guess she worked with some of the older boys. Is that right?
That's right.
So after the grain was shocked, it sat there a while for about a week, and then it was hauled in with wagons and stacked, big round stacks, and come up to a point. And then that would sit there probably 2 weeks or 3, and then the thrash machine would come along.
6 weeks.
The first thrash machine that I can remember good, they had to have 2 band cutters. And the man in the middle stood in the middle of the machine that fed the straw and grain in the separator. And there was 2 tables built on this here separator that the men pitched the bundles on that table, and the band cutters would cut the string on it, and the feeder he'd grab with both arms from both sides and pull that bundle in and feed it through the separator. Well, then after that, why, they got the separator that had knives on, and they didn't need no band cutters then. They'd pitch the bundles right in the elevator, and it elevated in the machine, and them knives would come around and cut the bands. They had the steam engine then for power, and of course they'd burn wood, and later on they'd burn coal. And they had a water tank wagon. They always called him the water monkey. He always had to see that they had enough water there so the steam engine could build up steam, you know. The way they handled the grain from the separator, why, the first time they, as I remember, they used to sack it all. Oh, they'd put a bushel and a half in each sack, and they'd pile it, set it up in the wagon till they had the wagon loaded with sacks from the front to the back end. And then we'd haul it to the granary, and we'd lift those sacks and carry them and dump them in the bins. And later on, why, they run the grain loose in the wagons and shovel the grain in. And help for thrashing the grain, the neighbors helped one another. Regardless how much you had, why, it made no difference. There was no extra charge if one man had more. It was the same with getting up a wood sawn. The neighbors would help one another to saw the wood, and that was a nice part of our help them days. Even when somebody was sick in the neighborhood, like a neighbor, and he wasn't able to do his work. I know one time we went over to Joe Strotman, and his wife was sick, and a man got up as a wood sawing bee. And we went over there with a crew of men and sawed up a big batch of wood for him for the winter. And another time was when John Lee had passed away, and his wife had needed help to get the corn out of their field. It wasn't chucked yet. And a bunch of men got together there, and we went up and helped chuck corn. And that was all free. I want to tell now, but the time when we started to build our house, we were married August the 25th, 1926, at Conception, Missouri. And then after we had taken a trip up north there through Iowa and Minnesota, then when we come home, while we stayed with my parents, and then in October, we started to build our house. And had to haul sand. We hauled sand from the creeks, had my brothers help me, and then I got Joe Coniger with a cement mixer, and well, at first I'll have to say how we dug the basement. I had Tony Meissen hired to help me dig the basement. We used plow and scraper, shovels and grubbing hoes.
Team of horses.
Team of horses for the power. And then we got Joe Coniger with a cement mixer, and we put in the foundation. Well, that was pretty close to the first part of November, and it started to freeze after that, and so we didn't do no more that winter. And then in March, we started to build. And I had Henry Bucky for carpenter. And we had a very rainy month that time, and there wasn't really too many people driving automobiles on the muddy roads them days, and he walked across the field. Oh, that was a couple of miles, and he'd be here early, and he'd even put in sometimes 10 hours in a day. And his wages was $3 a day. And the other men that I would hire to help work, I give them $2 a day. And he built this house in 1 month. Then on the 17th of May, we moved in here. And in the year of, that was in 1927, then in 1933, we had a storm that came through here and swung the barn over. It was leaning pretty badly, and so had to take it down, and we built a new barn. And this Henry Bucky was the main carpenter again, and with all the other help, he built that barn in 2 weeks' time. Hey, he was really a goer when it come to carpenter work. He'd have all kinds of men, and he'd keep them all busy. There.
Well, getting back to the way we used to work when we first started out, we didn't have linoleums and fancy floor coverings like they have today. We would scrub with a brush on our knees and use lye soap and water, no detergents. When it come to washing, we didn't have no washing machine either. We used the board and the tub. Carried our water from the barn quite a little distance, and we'd put it on the stove and heat it in the boiler. Sometimes we would boil the clothes in the boiler, then take them out and rinse them and hang them on the line. That's it. We have quite a memories from that black stove. We would bring the baby chicks in whenever we'd have a rain and they were caught outside. We'd bring them in and dry them by the stove and then take them back to the brooder house and let them go again. But then we'd bring in the lambs and sometimes little pigs, and we have brought in calves when it was a cold, stormy day and they were born, to dry them off. And then Fred would take them back out to the barn again.
In 1929, we built a cistern here by the house. Them days, earlier times, why, everybody in the country, they would dig cisterns and wells to get water, and it was all done by hand, the way we did it, and most everybody. They'd have 3 poles they'd lay up slant and tie the tops together with a log chain and put a pulley up there, and the bottom spread apart for the width of the wider than the cistern they're going to dig. And they'd have a horse to be pulled up the, had a barrel cut in two half of it, and had a big iron hook on it. And that horse was had his hitch rein snapped to a guide wire, stretched out some distance in order to pull that, hold him in line to pull that ground out of the cistern. And there'd generally be about 2 men work down in the cistern, digging with grubbing hoes and spades. And the man on top, he'd roll that big heavy tub around and dump the ground out of it. Then in 34, we were short of water for livestock. Ponds was dry, and so we had to kind of go out and prospect where to dig a well. So I went quite a ways east of the barn there, and that's when I dug that well. And I hit a good one that time. We dug it 12 foot deep, and when we hit coarse gravel, there was rocks in there big as hickory nuts and few as like walnuts. And the water come in, we had to stop digging and lay the rocks. And it's furnished water never did go dry then no more. And then later on, people went digging larger ponds. And I had built the one here south of the barn in the year of, it was in the year of 1957, and it was in the month of January. For water, and also the same with barn cisterns. Our barn cistern was dug about 1910, and it was laid up with bricks. It was 20 foot deep and 12 foot wide on the bottom, and they come up on a slant, and it ain't about maybe 4 foot or 3.5, 4 foot across on top. I want to go back to the farm machinery about the walking plow. They call it the walking plow, but it's got 2 handles on it. You've got to follow it, and you do the walking. And we'd plow about 1.5 acres was a good day's walking. But there's some would put in a big day, and they'd say they could plow 2 acres a day. And they figured that was 20 miles of walking. I had used a walking plow, I guess, until about, I guess it must have been about 36, and I got me a riding plow. There were some riding plows before that, and of course a lot of little farmers never bought them yet. And about the corn planters, my brother Joe, he helped Uncle Mike Hoover plant corn, and they marked the rows off with those high wheel wagons. Got 2, just took the back part of the wagon, so they had the 2 wheels, and they'd mark off in the fields, length, the crossways. And Joe was just a young schoolboy then yet, and he got him to sit on the planter, and they'd trip every time they'd come to one of them marks. And that's where they got their corn checked. So then later on, then they got a check wire that come in use. And you just throw that check wire over every time when you got over to one end, and had those buttons on a certain distance. And the check was pretty accurate, the crosswise. The rows was fairly straight. And that's where they could cross-cultivate it. They'd first cultivate it lengthways, and then crossways, and then lengthways for the 3rd time. I'll turn this tape over now on the other side. A lot of fertilizer now, that's why they can produce more corn per acre.